Hi, I'm Warren Estey, Head of Investment Banking at BMO Capital Markets, and this is our quarterly Capital Markets podcast.
Welcome to Markets Plus, where leading experts from across BMO discuss factors shaping the markets, economy, industry sectors, and much more. Visit bmocm.com/marketsplus for more episodes.
We've got a special show to kick off the year. Today, I am joined by Daniel Pink, who is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including his latest, The Power of Regret. His other books include When, A Whole New Mind, and the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell is Human. His deeply researched works have won multiple awards, have been translated into more than 40 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. Daniel, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Warren.
I have been looking forward to this conversation. There is a lot to cover, and I really want to get into it. So,
all right.
Your latest book is The Power of Regret. And in the book, you challenge the no regrets philosophy that I think we probably all ascribe to in some form. So how can organizations apply the insights from the book to foster a culture that encourages learning from mistakes and promotes continuous improvement amongst employees?
Sure. Well, it's important to understand, regret as a human emotion and just how common it is. I mean, truly, everybody has regrets. The only people who really don't have any regrets are people who are like little kids whose brains haven't developed, and people who are sociopaths, or people who have certain kinds of neurodegenerative disorders. So everybody has regrets. It is ubiquitous in the human experience. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why would something so unpleasant be so widespread? And the answer is because it's useful if we treat it right. And so the problem is that in leadership and in other parts of our lives, we haven't been treating it right. So some of us ignore our regrets. We say, nope, always look forward, never look back, always be positive, never be negative. Bad idea. Others of us wallow in our regrets, ruminate in our regrets, stew on our regrets. Bad idea too. What we should be doing is confronting our regrets, looking them in the eye, thinking of them. This is something I think bankers can do a good job of, thinking of them as data, thinking of them as information, thinking of them as, in some ways, a market signal. And when we do that, when we think about our regrets, it's a transformative emotion. People who process their regrets in a productive way become better problem solvers, become better negotiators, become clearer thinkers. And so that's at the big level. At the tactical level for leaders, I think one of the best things that leaders can do is assemble their team and tell the team about a regret that you have. Now, it's not an exercise in self-flagellation. What you should do is you should say, here's a regret that I have, here's what I learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do about it. And what that does is that normalizes this regret, and it turns this painful emotion into an engine of progress. And it creates what Amy Edmondson at Harvard and others have called psychological safety. We want to create environments where people can make intelligent mistakes, can take appropriate risks, can try stuff, and not get their head handed to them if it doesn't work.
Love it. Okay. I'm gonna go out on a limb and see if I can do that with my team. Yeah. I like it. Thank you. What are some of the most common regrets people have about their careers?
I think the biggest regret that people have in their careers is actually playing it too safe, not taking enough risks. I found this quite fascinating. Now, let me take a step back and tell you why I think I know this. As part of the research for this book, I collected regrets from all over the world. We have a database now of we're over 26,000 regrets from more than 130 countries. Wow. And around the world, people have very similar kinds of regrets. And one of them is a regret about boldness. So you're at a juncture in your life. You can play it safe or you can take the chance. And what I found really surprising is that overwhelmingly, people regret not taking the chance. Far more people regret not taking the chance, way more, than people who took a chance and it went south on them. And this is particularly true in careers. So people regret, I have a lot of people who regret saying, oh man, I'm stuck at this dead-end job and I really wanted to go out on my own and be an entrepreneur, but I didn't have the courage to do it. We have a lot of regrets in the workplace about speaking up. I knew something was wrong. I knew we could do it better. I didn't feel right about speaking up. There's one that I remember in particular. It's a man from the UK. He said, I found this really poignant. He said, I focused on not failing rather than succeeding. And so one of the things that we see in the research overall on regret is that over time, people regret inactions way more than actions. I mean, it's not even close. By the time people are in their 50s, 60s, it's like a 3-to-1 ratio between regrets of inaction and action. And a lot of the inaction regrets have to do with, I wasn't bold enough. I was too timid. I didn't take a chance. And that's especially true in careers.
That's really fascinating. And did you see in your research, was there a willingness to be bolder? Was there a correlation with age?
I'm not sure about the willingness to do that. I actually don't know the answer to that question. It's an interesting question. There is some evidence that entrepreneurs who start later in life are actually more successful than those who start earlier. We think that so entrepreneurs who start their careers, who start their entrepreneurial part of their careers later, like even like in their 50s, end up being more successful than those who go out as they're in their 20s. And I think it's partly because they are actually better able to balance the risk and the reward. Whereas what you see, it's interesting on age, what you see is that people in their 20s, actually they have about equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction because they're doing stuff and they're doing stuff that they regret. But that's right. But as people age, it's really these regrets of inaction that take over. And what you don't want in your career, in your personal life, you don't want to get to your 80s or 90s and be sitting there saying, "Oh, if only I had tried that. If only I had spoken up." You really don't want that. It gnaws at people. And if you know that when you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, you can do something about it.
Totally agree. So, given the changes in the workplace, including AI and automation, what skills or behaviors do you think will be the most critical for business success in the next decade?
Yeah, believe me. I mean, that's a question I want to know the answer to
myself. It's a big question, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
And I took a stab at this nearly 20 years ago in a book that I wrote called A Whole New Mind, where I argued that these so-called left brain skills, logical, linear, sequential, analytic skills, were becoming necessary but not sufficient. And it was really right brain skills, artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking that were becoming more important. I think that's still more right than wrong, but I've been blown away at how good generative AI is at creative tasks. It's very good at certain kinds of creative tasks. And that sort of changed my thinking a little bit. So I'm working my way through this, but among the skills that I think are most important, one of them is what I would like to call composition. That is, being able to put the pieces together. And I think it's fundamentally an artistic skill. When you have a painter will compose a painting, a musical artist will compose a symphony. You're taking all the pieces, you're putting them together. It's like making a deal. That's what a deal is in many ways, too.
Absolutely.
You're composing, you're putting the pieces together. You're not only focused on one element, but you're seeing how it works together, how they align, and so forth. So it's a compositional skill. I think that's one of them. The second one that I think a lot about now is taste. And I'll give you an example of that. Generative AI, by its very nature, by its name, it's in its name, is generative. It can create a lot of stuff. And so if you ask AI, a generative AI tool, a large language model, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT, give me a list of 50 ideas. It'll give you a list of 50 ideas. It's very good at that. Where you come in as an individual is you got to figure out what's a good idea and what's not a good idea. You have to have taste to be able to distinguish between those. And so I use that tool a lot in my writing. So for instance, a good example of it was I was doing this thing where I was sort of inventing a startup company for fun in something that I was writing that made blue light blocking glasses. Okay. All right, so how about a tech bro company that makes blue light blocking glasses? All right, what would be a good name for that for the glasses? So I had ChatGPT give me like 25 names, and none of them were very good. Then I had Claude give me 25 names. 24 of them weren't very good, but one of them was Balloonicorns. And I'm like, I love that name because it's funny. See, I laughed the same way that you did. And so you have to have the taste to be able to distinguish those things. So I think it's composition. I think it's taste. And then I also think there's something that you might even call loosely almost like pastoral skills, the skills of a pastor or a clergy person, which is kindness and generosity. Mm-hmm. And a sense of meaning. Those have become really important. And that's a very different set of skills. Those are skills that, I know that you have an MBA. You go to an MBA program, they're not teaching you taste, composition, and pastoral skills.
No, that's exactly right. Those three things are absolutely cause for reflection.
Yeah,
right? Like that's a great answer.
And I think that the other thing about them is that I think that they're interesting and I think that they're challenging. It's like having, like, we all have taste. We all have preferences. We have foods we like and don't like. We have art and music we like and don't like. We have a sense of what's good and what's not, what makes a great employee, and so like really honing your taste and exercising your taste and thinking of yourself, especially as a leader, as a composer. You are composing. And then also, especially for leadership, just these basic skills of just like being generous, being kind, helping people see the big picture are just, AI is not going to be able to do that.
That's right. I completely agree. Okay, so in your book, Drive, you emphasize the importance of intrinsic motivation. So how do leaders in traditional hierarchical organizations foster that type of motivation that can be so transformative amongst their employees?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a traditional hierarchical organization, my best recommendation would be to start small. Mm-hmm. And also just think about, what does the science tell us about what really motivates people to do great work over time? And it's less about dangling a reward in front of them and more about giving them a sense of autonomy, some control over what they do and how they do it, a sense of mastery, which is being able to get better at something that matters, make progress, and then also a sense of purpose. And so especially, I am not 100% against hierarchies. Basically, human civilization has always created hierarchies because they're efficient in doing certain kinds of things. What I'm generally against is over-indexing on control. That's the most important thing. When we think about autonomy, we can think about the opposite of autonomy, which is control. And what we also know is that even though human beings will naturally form hierarchies in certain circumstances, and they can be efficient, what we also know is that human beings have only two reactions to control. They comply or they defy. And if you're a leader, do you want people who are perfectly compliant? Probably not. I mean, you want compliance in the regulatory sense, obviously, for BMO or financial institutions and so forth. But you don't want people who say, okay, I will do exactly what Warren wants me to do, exactly the way he tells me to do it. That's not enough.
That's right.
You also don't want people who are defined. You want people who are engaged. And the way that people are engaged is by being able to sort of power their own engine. And one way to do that is to give people just a little bit more control over, say, what they do, what their assignments are, when they come into the office, where they work, how they work. And so notching up the autonomy, not from 3 to 10, but from 3 to 5 can play a big role. Helping people see the progress they're making day to day is extremely important, and then also the more that you can show people, even in a hierarchical system, why they're doing what they're doing. Like, why does it matter that you're doing this? Well, does it contribute internally and does it make a difference externally?
Great. So staying on the motivation theme, but also now layering in communication, what role does storytelling play in leadership and organizational success, and how can leaders use it effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's important and in some ways undervalued. We can make a kind of hard-headed case for white values because we live in a world of ubiquitous facts. There's so much information out there. There's so much knowledge out there that people don't need more facts. What they need in some ways is context, synthesis. And so what stories are is a way to put facts in context and deliver them with emotional impact. And that ends up being really important. And I think we sometimes underestimate how much people think in stories. That way they process the world in stories. When people come home from work, they don't, and their spouse says, "Hey, how was today?" They don't say, "Oh, here is my deck, my 14-slide deck with a flow chart explaining it." Right. You say, "Oh my gosh, first this happened, and then because of that, this happened, and then because of that, this happened, and in the end, this happened." That's how we process the world. So the more that leaders can think and understand that people think in those terms and chart their vision in those terms, chart their marketing campaigns in those terms, and recognize that people are part of a bigger story, that they're actors in a bigger story. I think that can be extraordinarily effective. Again, it's another one of the things that I think really good leaders pick it up in some ways intuitively, but it's something that can benefit from maybe a little bit greater instruction, and also just from things like more leaders reading, more novels and fewer business books, which is something I shouldn't say. My publisher will kill me for saying that. But read. Listen. This year, read 2 fewer business books and 2 more novels.
Right. As I was preparing for this interview, and I picked up on the storytelling theme. My thoughts almost immediately went to Winston Churchill. Talk about someone who used almost storytelling to get the British people, and really almost, certainly Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought him over the line and kept the English people in the fight when it looked like all was lost. Right. And so your comments about storytelling really resonate with me. And I think as leaders, storytelling with authenticity.
Absolutely.
Right. To me is like the most important thing.
I'm so glad that you said that, because storytelling is not BSing. Okay. Right. In fact, that does you more harm than good. It's really about authentic storytelling, telling the truth, and telling the truth in a way that makes what's happening in the moment even clearer. And remember, Winston Churchill, to your point, Winston Churchill, before he became prime minister, in the middle of his becoming prime minister, he was a writer. He was writing like popular histories. And so he had a good sense of that. And that skill turned out to be the right match for that moment, just as I think it's the right match for this moment.
Yep, agreed. Okay. So how do you see the connection between physical health and the ability to cultivate mental focus and discipline in one's personal and or professional life?
I mean, I truly wish more people would ask that question and ponder that connection, because I think the connection is powerful. Mm-hmm. Powerful. I'll give you 2 dimensions of that. Number one, if you think about something like exercise, I cannot find a single thing in our lives that is unequivocally good for us, except for exercise. All right. I mean that very seriously.
No, I agree. I agree.
Exercise is That's so, a great point. Like every piece of research that comes out says exercise is good for your problem solving skills. Exercise is good for your mental health. Exercise is good for your ability to sleep. Exercise is good for everything. And so, and I think that organizations can do a better job of kind of encouraging exercise or incorporating it into people's day-to-day activities. I mean, it really is an unalloyed good. And I can't think of another thing in our lives that is so good for us. So that's one thing. The second thing would be I wrote about this in another book, some really interesting research on breaks and the importance of taking breaks. It doesn't necessarily have to be exercise, but just taking breaks. We have this idea, and Americans and Canadians and Brits are the worst at this, is that we have this idea that the way to get more and better work done is to power through. That amateurs take breaks, professionals don't take breaks, that it's actually morally virtuous to power through. And it's just not true. We have to think of breaks as part of our performance rather than a deviation from our performance. And so here's where I think leaders can play a role. Leaders can sort of systematically take certain kinds of small breaks and model them for other people. And we know that breaks, we know the ingredients. You should be taking breaks that are outside, where you're in motion, where you're leaving your phone behind, and it's actually somewhat social. And so when breaks that are, as I said, where you're social, not solo, where you're moving, not stationary, where you're detached from your work, just 15 minutes a day can play a big role. And I think it's such an important question you asked, because there is this tendency sometimes to think about the people who ourselves, but even the people in our companies, as just like sort of brains on sticks, like all you want. But the thing is, the brain is part of our body. It's all connected here. And so the more physically healthy people are, the better they're going to be at their jobs, the happier they're going to be, better off we're going to be overall.
Completely agree. I'd love to hear what your personal routine is to start your day, to get you going, to help you maintain discipline throughout the day.
Yeah, if I had to rely on just my own discipline and willpower, I would be toast. So instead, I have become a creature of routine. This is particularly true for writing. What I do, I treat writing as essentially a blue-collar job. I think about my writing as a bricklayer. So when I'm writing something, I come into my office. And I come in at a certain time. I come in at 8:30. I'm not super early. I'm not super late. I come into my office at 8. My office is just a garage behind my house. come into my office at 8:30, and I give myself a word count. I say, today, you need to write whatever it is, 500 words, 600 words, 700 words. Not a massive number, but a meaningful number. I don't bring my phone with me into the office. I don't answer my email. I don't do anything until I hit that number. Some days, I hit the number at 10 o'clock. Other days, miserable days, horrible days, days I detest, I don't hit it till 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. But I don't do anything until I hit that number. I don't watch sports highlights. I don't respond to email. It's the only thing that I do. And then once I do that, I can do other stuff. And then I do it the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And so it's like I come in, I lay a few bricks, come back the next day, lay a few more bricks, come back the next day, lay a few more bricks, et cetera, et cetera. If I waited to write until I was inspired, I would not have written anything. So truly. And so what happens is like, oh my God, at 8:35, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to write 500 words. Then I get over myself at like 8:40, and then I start doing my work. Then I do it the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So I'm a big believer that structure can be liberating. And so at least for me it is.
Well, it's also the consistency of the discipline that you employ, right? Which is really key, right?
I mean, I am such a big believer in consistency. I'll give you that. So I wrote my first book. I wrote in what I like to call heroic bursts. So I would do nothing, and then I would wig out, and I would drink like a thermos of coffee, and I would write 2,000 words in a frenzy. It's not a good way to do things, you know. In the same way, like if you sit on your butt and don't exercise for a week, and then say, "Oh, it's Saturday, I got to go run 14 miles," you might do that, but it's going to hurt a lot. Right. You're better off, running 4 miles and then 4 miles and then 4 miles. You're better. So I am a convert that in almost every realm of life, consistency beats intensity. Just consistency. And I look for that when I partner with people to do projects on. I look for people who are consistent rather than heroic.
Yeah. So if you could recommend one daily habit to business leaders, any suggestions? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on context. The one thing that I would say is, because it's been helpful to me, and I know it's been helpful to some other people, is sort of find your MIT, that is your most important task. Really think hard about, in a given day, what's the most important thing you have to do today? Mm-hmm. And do that first. A lot of times we seduce ourselves into thinking that we're being productive when we are answering email, when we're going to meetings, but really setting out that intention. What is my most important task today? And carving out time to do that first. I found that to be transformative because I was someone who's easily lured into thinking that answering email or doing a call or going to a meeting is productive, when in fact there's certain things that actually make a huge difference today and in the future. And what often happens, it happens to me, it happens to other people, it's like, it's 6 o'clock, it's like, oh my God, the most important thing I had to do today, I haven't even had time for. So I either have to do it at night or it's like, oh God, I just give up and do it again. So if you just take that and do it first, I found that really transformative.
Okay, got it. I will try to incorporate that. All right, last question. So you have met and interviewed and collaborated with a wide variety of highly successful people across really a variety of industries. What are some of the most common traits you observe in those successful individuals?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I haven't really thought that much about it, but it is a question that it's worth pondering myself, and it's also, I think, a great question for people listening. Like I would love to hear other people's answer to this question. For me, I guess I would say the first one is that they show up. Mm-hmm. Okay. And what I mean by that is they don't say, I really want to start a company. They show up and write a business plan. And then they show up and they look for investors. And then they show up and they hire their first employee. And then they don't talk about stuff. They show up and do their work. And that's true in anything, whether they're a physician, whether they're a writer, whether they're an artist, whatever. They show up. And they also, and the other dimension of show up is they show up for other people too. So when there are people in their lives who need a hand, they show up for that. So it sounds really simple, but a lot of people don't show up. And so showing up is one. The other thing that I would say, and I played around with this, trying to come up with a word to describe it, is the people you're describing, the people who, I think are cool or interesting, impactful, doing good things, they seem to have the right mix of confidence and humility. They're not over-indexed on one. Too much confidence, you're going to make some big blunders, people won't go along. Too much humility, you might not take enough risk. And so they seem to blend, like you look at them and they say, like, is that person confident or are they humble? And the answer is yes. And that's what you want, Right. And so they're not trading those things off. They're recognizing a way that you can be a confident person and be a humble person at the same time. And both of those traits, I think, are really important in getting stuff done, but also for leadership. People want to follow confident leaders and they want to follow humble leaders. And so if you can somehow figure out how to do both, I think that's a freaking secret sauce.
Totally agree. Well, look, I could go on for a long time, but I think we need to wrap it up there. Daniel, that was really valuable, and I sincerely appreciate you spending the time with us today.
A total pleasure. Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks for listening. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, visit bmocm.com/marketsplus.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.